In this masterclass, we're going to be learning to build a full-fledged to-do list app in SwiftUI. Let's take a peek at what we're going to be building. Here's the app we're going to put together. We're going to be able to sign users up and of course log them in with these beautiful screens here with some reusable components. Let's go ahead and sign in and peek further into the functionality of this app. So here I've got a pre-existing account. Let me just sign in here. And boom, once we sign in, we can actually see our existing to-do list items. This looks great in both light mode and dark mode. We'll see in a moment. We can check items as done or mark them as incomplete. We can also swipe to delete and of course create new items. When creating a new item, we'll also be handling errors. So if we try to save without handling a valid title and inputting a due date, we have this beautiful calendar for our due date here. And once we create something new, it automatically shows up in our list. Now we also have these two tabs at the bottom. The first one is this list, of course, and the other one is the profile here where we have some basic info and a way to sign out. This looks great in light mode and dark mode across the entire app. Hope you're excited. Destroy the like button below and let's dive right in. Welcome to lesson 1 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. In this part, we're going to start setting up our project, integrate Firebase, and just create a bunch of empty files that we are going to work on in the upcoming parts. Before jumping in, hit that like button down below, subscribe if you're into iOS, open up Xcode, and let's create a new project here. So hopefully you have Xcode installed already. If not, you can get it from the App Store for free, the Mac App Store. I'm going to assume you have some basic working knowledge of the Swift language, and let's dig in. So we're going to select the app template under iOS, and I'm going to call this a to-do list app. Maybe we'll get rid of the word app. The important configuration here that you want to use is SwiftUI for the interface and of course Swift for the language here. Go ahead and continue and save the project wherever you'd like. I will toss it onto my desktop here. And we should get something like this in our window. So on the right hand side, you might have a spinner. It's trying to load the SwiftUI preview. On the left, we got our template for our content view. And what we want to start by doing is actually bringing in Firebase into our project. And like I mentioned, we're going to use Firebase for authentication as well as a database, aka Firestore. So what we'll want to do is hit File at the top left, hit Add Packages, and I've already actually used this before. So if I just search Fire, you'll find Firebase iOS SDK. If you're not familiar with Firebase, what you can do is just go to Google and search Firebase iOS, and there are some basic steps where you'll get a URL to paste into here to integrate this to your project. So cool, so since I have it here already, let me select it. I'll continue here. It's gonna take a few seconds to resolve it. The first time you do it, it's a little bit longer, but just bear with it. And you're gonna see a list of the various packages and libraries that Firebase offers, and we're gonna want to select a few of them from the list. So just bear with it here. There it goes. Okay, so here we have a nice long list of stuff that is available. What we wanna check is Firebase Auth, which allows us to create and sign users in. And we're also going to want Firebase Firestore and Firebase Firestore Swift. Firestore is the document-based database that Firebase offers. So once you've got all of those checked, just go ahead and continue. Hit Command B to build your project, and we should be in good shape. So it's saying that it's already building, so we'll hit cancel and let that actually run over there. Let me full screen my window here. All right, cool. So it looks like it did indeed successfully build. And on the left-hand side, you should see all these package dependencies pop up. So cool. So now we want to actually bring in a configuration file. So you're going to head to firebase.com, sign in to your Google account, and we're going to create a brand new free project here. So here we will give it a name of, let's call it, we'll call it SwiftUI to-do list. That'll be our project name. Hopefully it's unique. We'll pretend like we read all of this. We can actually just leave all the configuration the same. We'll select a default Google Analytics account and hit create and let it do its thing. So while it's doing that, let's come back to our Xcode window. And in our project navigator, by selecting the top item here, we want to make a few changes. We are going to uncheck landscape for both iPhone orientation and landscape and upside down for iPad orientation. That is indeed important here. The other thing we want to do is for our display name, we're going to call this to-do list. This is essentially the name of our application that shows up under our app icon. And we want to make note of our bundle identifier here. For me, it's io.iosacademy.todo list. We're going to want to enter this into Firebase in 2 seconds. So speaking of which, looks like this is done. Let's continue here. And now that we've created a Firebase project, we need to add an iOS app to it by selecting iOS. And here is where you're going to want to enter that bundle identifier. So we'll do iosacademy.todo list to make sure your casing does indeed match. I believe that should be good. Yep, looks good to me. And we'll put in a general name here. So let's call this iOS to-do list. All right, and we can leave that Apple ID empty. And when you continue here, what it'll spit out in the next step is this Google Services plist file, and you'll need to hit that button to download it. And we're gonna bring this into our project. It's basically all the configuration files. Well, it's one file with all the configuration information, bit of a tongue twister, to make sure Firebase successfully connects to our client app, our iOS app. So we're gonna skip all this jazz since we'll do it ourselves. And let's come back to Xcode and drag in this new file that we just got from Firebase. So let me drag this in, we'll drop it right there. And you wanna make sure that the target membership and copy items if needed is indeed checked. So now that we've got the file in, we do need to do 2 more tiny things in the console here to get our app prepped in terms of Firebase setup. The first thing you'll want to do is open a build and go to Authentication and just toggle this on. We're just going to say get started, and we need to let Firebase know what type of authentication our app is going to support. Firebase does give us, functionality for sign in with a phone number, Google, Facebook, etc. But what we're going to work with is email and password. So we'll just select it, flip on the switch to be on, and hit save. Cool, so now we've got authentication set up, and the other thing we want to set up here is our Firestore database, which is under build. Similar here, we are going to hit get started, and it's going to ask some basic setup. The first step, we're going to say, instead of a production database, let's start this up in test mode, which is perfectly fine for our use case. We'll continue. We are going to then specify our location of our Firestore server, basically wherever our data is going to originate from. Whatever the default is, most likely it's fine. Go ahead and continue and give it a few seconds to get its life together, and it should be good to go. So alrighty, let's give our application a build and run in a simulator. We're gonna be working with the iPhone 14 Pro throughout this series. So I've got that selected already. So we'll hit this big play button at the top left, which should indeed build and pop up our simulator like so for us there. And we should see our empty application open. And I believe it's gonna say hello world. Let's jump back to our contents view and see. Yeah, we should see hello world pop up in the center here. Maybe not, maybe it's just a little slow, bear with it. The first time you run your app, it can be a little slow, so cool, there it is, it does indeed pop up. If you wanna switch between light mode and dark mode, which we will do periodically throughout this video, you can hit Command-Shift-A, and that's how you can switch that. You just saw me do it right there. So now that we've got that good to go, we do need to do one more thing to actually tell our app to connect to our backend, aka Firebase. What we're gonna do is go into the to-do list app Swift file, and this is basically the entry point for our app. What we want to do is import Firebase core is what I'm looking for. And we are going to stub out the initializer, and we'll say Firebase app.configure. Now, when you do this and build and run your app, everything should be working as before. You won't visually see anything different, but if your app does indeed crash, that means most likely you forgot to bring in this Google Services file. In other words, what it's probably saying is, and what it's actually trying to do is it's saying, hey, configure this app with all the information in here. But if it can't find it, it basically freaks out and crashes and says, hey, this is a problem, you need to fix it. So now that our basic project is set up, we are successfully connected to our Firebase backend here. Let me just refresh the page and make sure Firestore is good to go as well. What I'll do for the remainder of this video is just create some folders on the left here and some empty files that we will be filling out throughout the next several videos. So let's create some folders. So you can hit this and hit new group, right click and hit new group, or you can hit Command Option N. And I guess what we'll want is 4 different folders. The first one will be our views. The views folder will basically hold what it sounds like it's going to hold, everything the user will visually see, aka views. We are also going to have a folder called ViewModels, and these are going to be objects that allow our views to be intelligent and do stuff, right? So the actual logic of a view. So for example, when I hit log in after typing in an email and password, an object in ViewModels will actually handle that interaction for us. Next up, we're going to want our models. This is going to represent our core data types in our project. So in our case, we're going to have a user and a to-do list item, right? N number of users can sign up, and a single user can create however many to-do list items that we'll be saving in our backend as well. And what I like to do for the 4th folder is just create an other, which is a grab bag of anything that doesn't nicely fit into these 3. So let's start moving stuff around. We'll put our Google Services file in there. We have our main app entry point. We'll stick that in other as well. We have our default content view. I'll stick that into views. I guess we can throw assets into other, and we should be in pretty good shape. All right, so let that build, give it a run once more, make sure nothing accidentally broke with me dragging stuff around. I can delete this Google Services file from my desktop because it's been copied to the project, and we're in pretty good shape. So before we wrap up here, let's create some empty files and talk about some basic series workflow stuff. So you're going to often see me refresh this preview on the right, which is called the canvas, and the shortcut on your keyboard to do that is Command Option P. You can also hit the little refresh button that you had seen there. You can drag the section here for our canvas and our code respectively. So I like keeping it as small as possible where I can see it and our code has enough room to breathe. And I'll bump up that font size as well. And let's create some Swift files and talk about what on earth we're going to need. So I believe this simulator has the finished app on it already. So here we are. Let's take a look at it. So this is our login screen. So we definitely need a login view. When we hit this button, we get a register view, which is awfully similar to login, but we do need a view for that. And if I go and log in here, if you bear with me, and I believe my super secret password is just password, you'll see we'll probably want a view for our list of items. We'll want a view to enter in and create new items, and we'll want a view for the profile here as well. So irrespective of how on earth we're going to actually create these, let's create SwiftUI views that are going to represent all this jazz. So here we have content view. I don't like the name that much. I'm going to change it to main view, and this is basically what our application is going to open to. Just make sure that you rename it in both your implementation here, down below in your preview, as well as in your application's app file. So in its window group, the file, the view that it opens up to is your main view. And that's a much better name than just content view, which is a little generic. Debatably, main is generic as well, but that's okay. So let's create a new file in here by hitting Command N, and we will be searching for SwiftUI views. And let's start creating the views that we briefly discussed here. So we have profile view. So I'll call this profile view. And we're not going to be doing anything in these views in this video. We're literally just creating these empty views and files that we can work with later on. So here we'll have to-do list items view. So this is kind of what it sounds like. This will serve this tab where it shows all of our items. We'll want a view where we can actually create new items. So let's create a file for that as well. And this one will be new items, or new item, because we create one item at a time, singular. New item view. Alrighty, looking pretty good. And then we definitely also did have a login screen. So we'll want a login view. Looking good. Let's create another SwiftUI file for registration. Here we will have our register view. All right, and let's think about what else we might need. So here we have on the list of items, a list of these like draggable row things. So one could probably infer that, hey, we could probably, stick all of this in the to-do list item view, but maybe we want each of these rows, we want to have a separate abstracted view, a file where we can basically design the way that this row looks, right? Having a little check mark on the left, or on the right, I should say, having the labels on the left, things of that nature. So what I'll do is create a SwiftUI view for that as well. So we'll create a SwiftUI view, and we're going to call this a to-do list item view, and not to be confused with our previously to-do list items view. So what I'll actually do is let's rename this to-do list view. I'll get rid of the word items just so the naming is not as similar. Make sure you get rid of it in the implementation, and then make sure you get rid of it down in your preview as well. Hit Command B to build, make sure everything is still building. If you have any errors, just check for typos and things of that nature. And those are essentially all the views that we'll most likely need. I might have forgotten one or two, but I digress. We can add them along the way as we build. Now let's create some more files. So in models, I had briefly mentioned we have two models in our project. So we'll create a Swift file, and we're gonna have something that represents a user. So whenever someone signs up, and then of course, we're gonna have something that represents a to-do list item. So this is the data itself that we are going to basically be working with. You can imagine in larger apps, you'll have tons and tons of models, but in our case, this is what we will be working with. Awesome. So the last thing we're going to do is create ViewModel Swift files. The way that I like to think about this is that every view, most likely, will have its own view model. So the simplest way to approach this is for the 7 views that we have down below, let's just create 7 Swift files. And what I like to do is just take the name of the view and then append the word view model at the end of it. So in this case, we have main view, view model. And it's just a Swift file for now. We're not going to do any implementation. So let's just get these created and out of the way. That way we kind of have a picture of what our overall project is going to start looking like. So let's do profile view, stick on view model, boom, created. Let's do this a few more times for our other ones, and then we can get on with actually the good stuff and creating stuff in the upcoming videos. So here we have to-do list view, view model. I realize that the word view here is redundant. It's by design for consistency, so just run with it. Similarly, we have our new list item, or rather our new item view. I'm going to confuse list and item. I feel like a lot throughout these videos, so bear with me. So new item view, stick on view model. Good to go. Next up, we have our login and register views. Alrighty, let me create that. So here we'll have our login view model. Alrighty, let's create another one for our register view model. And I'm flying through these file creations just because, we all can learn from creating one how to create the others. But the important thing is just make sure you have one file for a view model per view. And our last one here is our to-do list item view model. So to-do list item view model. Awesome. Hit Command B, which is going to build your project. You can also hit the little play button at the top left. And let's just hit that play button and we'll see our application running. Nothing has changed from the template. We still see hello world, but we're in really good shape to start building out each of these views, the actual logic and interaction with it, and making this thing actually work. So thanks for sticking around. Hopefully you've gotten this far and you've got your project set up. I will see you in lesson 2. Let me know in the comments if you hit any issues, if you have any questions. Destroy that like button for the YouTube algorithm. As always, appreciate y'all watching, and onwards we go. All right, party people, welcome back to lesson 2 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. In the last video, we did some basic project setup, hooked up Firebase to this Xcode project, and created some empty Swift files. And in this video, we're gonna actually start building some stuff out. So before we jump into things, hit that like button below, subscribe if you're into SwiftUI, and let's continue. So we're going to build out the login screen, the view, login view for our application. And this is what we want to show when our user, launches the app and they're not signed in. So let's get to it. So here we have our main view. If you guys recall, this is the view that we are opening up to when our app launches inside of our window group. If you recall, we changed it to main view. And inside of here, we have just an image and our hello world text. So instead of this hello world text and image, what I'd like to do is show our login view while we build it. So we actually already created this login view SwiftUI view on the left-hand side here. So we can just delete that and toss in a login view like so. We are also going to wrap this login view inside of a navigation view. Now, this navigation view will allow us to show and dismiss a registration view if we need to, right? When the user taps on register. I'm also going to delete that padding there, and we can jump into this login view. You can hit the file on the left, or you can command click on login view and hit jump to definition. And this will basically just open up wherever that object lives, which is in the login view Swift file. So cool, good deal. Now, in our login view, if we actually open up the simulator, let's take a look at what we're aiming to build here. I have the finished app on here as well. Our login view, let me open this up and let me just sign out, basically has this nice title at the top, a subtitle, this like wonky pink background thing, and then we've got our form to sign in. And then at the bottom, we also have some text about if you're new here, you can create an account. So this is the view and the user interface that we're going to attempt to make, starting off with our header. So let me actually move this right next to Xcode so we can have something to reference and we can start building it out. So by just looking at this, we can see that the elements are arranged vertically. So my instinct is to start by using a vertical stack. And let's put some comments in here. At the top, we're going to want a header. We're going to want the login form itself with our fields as well as our button. And then we're going to want the create account jazz, below that. So let's work on this header. So for this header, we want basically a Z stack because we have this pink thing. And then on top of it, we have two labels that are vertically oriented. So a Z stack will enable us to do that. So let's create a Z stack here. And this Z stack is going to start by having a rounded rectangle. And maybe we'll make a corner radius of, let's try a corner radius of just 10. Maybe we actually don't need this because we actually are going to rotate this. So let's actually just get rid of that, make it 0. Now that we've got this here, we want to set a color for it. So we're going to say foreground color is going to be pink. And if you see on the right-hand side of our window, we do have Xcode automating basically the canvas update. We can see our preview, which is really nice. So now that we have got this, we want to adjust the heights. We also want to rotate it and we want to move it up. So let's do all of that. So in our Z stack, we've got this here. Let's adjust the height of this whole thing. So I want to say frame is going to have a width and a height. So we'll say our width here, let's just do 100 for a second. And we'll say the height is 300. Now the width should basically be wider than the entirety of the screen because once we rotate it, we don't want it to be cut off. So what we can actually do here is we can say, hey, use the current screen's bounds dot width. So basically our main screen, this iPhone screen, use its width, and I'm going to multiply it by 3. So it is definitely wider than the available screen size here, and you'll see momentarily why we're doing that. So good deal. So now that we have this here, what I want to do is in the Z stack, we're going to add a vertical stack here, and we're going to have 2 elements, right? The first one is going to be a title. So we'll say to do list, and the next one is going to be a subtitle, which I guess we'll say get things done. Obviously put here whatever you would like, and we want to style both of these labels a little bit. So let's make both the foreground color on these white. This top one I will go and make bold, And for the top one, we're also going to set the font size. We'll use a system size of perhaps 50. And then for the bottom one, maybe we'll use 30. These are numbers that I'm literally just making up. So if you want to use a different number, by all means, don't hesitate to. So cool. So we now have this header thing here. It is a Z stack. Let me toss a spacer at the bottom of our entire V stack to push this guy up. Let's make sure it does indeed move up. All right, it does move up, cool. Now we want to rotate this pink background rounded rectangle. And luckily there's an easy way to do this. We can actually just apply a rotation effect, which can take in an angle. And we're gonna say an angle gets created with degrees, and maybe we'll do -15. I think that's the opposite direction of what we want. Let's try 15 actually. But you can actually use any degree in here. So cool, we've now created this. And to get the effect that I've got going on in this final product here, where it's kind of from the top of the device, we just want to move this pink thing up. So we want the offset to be negative in the Y direction. So we'll say offset, and what I'll use is Y, and let's try -50 and see if that looks right. Probably need a smidge more, so let's do maybe, let's try like a negative like 100 and see what that looks like. Alrighty, so that's 1,000, that's a little too much obviously. So -100 looks like it's okay, but our text is now white on white since it's a little too low. So we'll probably want to move that a smidge up. Instead of actually moving the rounded rectangle up, I kind of want to try moving this entire thing up. Okay, so that looks a lot better, but our text is now a little too close to the notch up here. So what we're gonna wanna do is just move this down. Either we can use offset or we can use padding. I'm gonna choose to use padding for top and just make it 30. And if you look at that, we actually have this header basically done. So we have to-do list, we have a nice subtitle, and it's looking pretty good. So one thing that we are going to do often throughout this series is start abstracting stuff when it becomes a little involved. So in this case, our header is a little involved here. So let me grab this whole thing and we're gonna abstract it into a header view. So we obviously don't have this header view thing here. So let's create a new file. It's going to be a SwiftUI file, and that's not SwiftUI. Let's make sure it is. Yep, SwiftUI view, and go ahead and call this a header view. And inside of this, just paste on that Z stack and all that jazz we created in the previous file. If you hit Command B and Command Option P for Pinocchio, basically, to make sure we don't confuse our letters there, you should see that header view in here, and back in our login view, all this is a lot cleaner now. So let's continue onwards. Let's make our form. To create a form, we can use, surprise, surprise, a form. A form is going to have a few text fields, one text field and one secure field. The first argument will be the placeholder, and the second argument will be a binding that we will create. So I'm just going to create it in this for the time being. So here we'll say at state var text is an empty string. Let me actually make two of these. So we'll say email and password. Now we are going to move this stuff to the view model, but just bear with me for the time being. So here we're going to say $email, copy and paste this, and this one will now become a secure field. Now for both of these, we are going to set a field style. So text field style, and what we're looking for, if you just type in field style, you'll see a lot of the available ones right down there in the dropdown. So we're gonna look for the rounded variant, and I'm just gonna close that left panel so we have a little more room to work with. Alrighty, and if you hit Command-Shift-P, you should actually see your fields here. They're a little difficult to see, so let's actually see this in dark mode as well. At the bottom of our canvas, we can hit this little 3x2 grid thing, and we can say show me different color variants, and this will actually populate the light mode and dark mode variants here, so you can actually click and see them both live as you develop. So that's pretty cool. Let's create a continue button or a login button. So we're going to create a button, and the variant we want is with an action and a label. For the action, we're gonna say attempt login. Obviously nothing going on in the action quite yet. And in the label, this is basically what we want our button to look like. We are going to have a Z stack, and this is going to be a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 10. We'll give it a foreground color of blue. And then on top of that, I'm gonna have a text label that says login. We will make this bold indeed. And if you hit Command Shift P to refresh your preview, you should start to see your button, but we don't actually see the text because we do need to say it is a foreground color of white. By default, it'll take a tint color, which just so happens to be blue. So cool, so we've got our login screen coming along pretty nicely. And finally, to wrap this up, what we'll want is that it'll create account blurb at the bottom. So for new users, like us actually, we're gonna create a way to navigate to the registration page. So down here, we'll create a vertical stack, and in our vertical stack, we're gonna have a label that says new around here, question mark, and then we'll have a button that says create an account, and here we will basically say show registration. So let's just make sure it does indeed pop up. Okay, it definitely does show up. And let me go and just add a little bit of bottom padding here. Maybe we'll say 50. That way it'll just, push it up a smidge. And let's give this a run in our simulator and make sure it actually does look nice. So cool, this is our screen. If we hit the home button, we can actually compare it to our final product, and they basically look identical, barring some padding differences. Let's click on create account, nothing happens. Let's actually hook this up to open the registration screen, and then we will wrap this video up there after a brief overview and summary of what we did. So we actually created this login view inside of a navigation view. So if you open up the main view, and pro tip, you can hit Command Shift O to search for any file in your project, you'll see we wrapped this in a navigation view. Why did we do that? We did that because we want to be able to navigate to another view, in this case, registration. So let me actually move this navigation view. Whoops, let's move that navigation view. Let's go back to Xcode. Into login view itself. So I'll come inside of here, and with this VStack, I'm going to cut the whole thing, and we're going to nest it inside of a navigation view. Alrighty. Now that we've got this here, we can actually say, hey, when we tap on a button to go to create an account, we actually want to go to a particular destination. So we can do this in a variety of ways, but one of the simplest ways is by using a navigation link, and we want the variant that has a title and a destination. So we're actually going to delete this button and move that string here, and this will more or less show a button, but we're going to be able to say, hey, once we tap it, go to the register view. And let's just see the preview here, and let's see what it looks like. It should look basically exactly the same as our button from before. It's actually indistinguishable. The difference is when I tap on it, we should be able to go to our registration view, our destination. So let's give this a run in our simulator, make sure it's all working, and we'll be in good shape. Cool, awesome. So we definitely are able to navigate here. We obviously don't have a nice UI here quite yet, but we also have a back button up here. I can tap into the field here, and we do actually get our keyboard. We might want to put this in a scroll view so our field is not overlapped by the keyboard. One other thing that I will call out before wrapping up here is you can indeed change the way that your text fields in the form look. I've used both the rounded fields before. You can also use the default style if you prefer. The default style looks quite nice as well. Let's just give this a refresh in our preview here. There are slight variants, and you do want to make sure you don't forget to change this to password and the binding here to $password as well. Alrighty, let's give this a build and run. Let's make sure this is still looking good. All right, looks pretty good. So I actually like the way this looks a little better because the entire form's background color is used for the fields as well, which ends up looking a lot nicer. Maybe on this button down here, we'll add a smidge of padding. But I digress. You can sit and optimize it and make it look exactly how you'd like, your heart desires. So this is our login view, and none of it is functional yet as designed. Appreciate y'all sticking around. I will see you guys in the next lesson where we'll continue building out this app. Welcome to lesson 3 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. We're going to continue where we left off after we had built our login view. So let's start working on our registration view. Before we jump in, make sure you destroy that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Also say hello in the comments. I always love hearing from you guys. So we had created this pretty darn awesome looking login view, and we wanted to create our registration view as well. So let me actually get rid of our color scheme permutations here. We don't really care to see them anymore. We just want to see our single preview on the right hand side. And I will jump into our register view as soon as it loads. Awesome. So let's jump into register view, and just to refresh y'all's memory, our register view and our final product looks like this, right? So we can see we have a pretty similar looking header. So we want to create that, and then we also want a form similar to login. We just don't want anything at the bottom. So what I'm inclined to do is actually copy and paste a lot of our code for our register screen. So let me actually do that. Let me create a VStack. Maybe we'll start with this header view, and let's see if we can repurpose any of this jazz. So I'll come into here and drop in this, and let's refresh our preview on the right. And cool, we now have our header, but clearly there's a problem, right? So in registration's case, we wanted to say register and start organizing your to-dos, but in this case, we have whatever we hard-coded to our header view. So that's no good. What we're gonna learn in this video is how we can actually repurpose our abstracted views to be generic, right? So we have one header view, but right now it actually has a fixed angle in terms of its rotation. It has some fixed strings for its actual title and subtitle. Similarly, it has a fixed background color, so on and so forth. So let's get to it. So what I'll actually do here is we want to pass into this header view a title and subtitle. So here we'll have a title string and a subtitle string. And instead of hard coding it inside our usage here, this will take title and this will take subtitle. Now, additionally, what we'll want is we want a rotation angle that we're going to pass in, and this is going to be of type double. And finally, we also want a background color, which is going to be of type color. Respectively, we want to make sure we use them here instead of using our hard-coded values. So there will be background, this one will be angle. Now, if you try to build, you're going to see an issue, right? Respectively to our usage, we need to pass these arguments in. We've said that this view takes in these 4 things, but it's yelling at us starting down here and saying, hey, you didn't pass these in. So let's pass them in. So here, this is the code for our preview. So here we'll say title, we'll just make it title. Subtitle, we'll say subtitle. For our angle, maybe we'll make it 15. And for our background color, we'll make it blue. If you hit Command-Shift-P, let's see if we're able to see our updated preview. Nope, we are not able to see it because we still have an error elsewhere in our project. So let's jump to our other 2 usages of our header view. So there are 2 of them. One is in login and one is in register. So I'll start off with login. So in login, what we want to do is similarly provide all our arguments. So the title will be to-do list. Our subtitle will be get things done. Our angle, I believe, was 15, and our background was pink. Let's copy this into our register usage of our header view, and we're going to change everything. So we'll say the title, in this case, will be register. Our subtitle here will be start organizing to-dos. Our angle is going to be -15. Let me fix that typo. And let's make the background color orange and see what that looks like. So now, if you actually give your preview a refresh, if it doesn't automatically, you'll see our header now looks like what we want it to look like for register. Let me jump back to login and let our canvas load the preview here. This still looks awesome in terms of what we want it to look like for our login screen. And if we go to our header view and refresh this, you'll see in this case, it's actually blue and it says title and subtitle. And where it's getting that from is our preview of the SwiftUI view right down here on line 40. So this is how we can reuse SwiftUI views and components and make them configurable for different screens, rather than copy and pasting everything we've already worked so hard to build and changing it for different cases, right? We don't want a login header view and a register header view. And you can imagine as our app matures, we might have, a dozen header views. It makes a lot more sense to just repurpose our existing code. So that is a primer for reusing our stuff in different views. Let's jump back to our register view. And inside of here, we want to push this guy up. So let me actually add a spacer here. And that does indeed push it up. And let's give this a run. Let's make sure that we are successfully able to go from login to register. Alrighty, looking pretty good. We might actually need to push this up a little bit more in this case, because it does look like for this case, we actually see a little bit of white or black at the top left. So let me adjust this a smidge. So let's jump into header view and we're gonna change the offset. So let me look for offset here. We are offsetting this whole thing -100. We have a height figured out here. Let's make it -150 and let's make the height taller by 50. Let's give that a run. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, it looks good. We probably need to move our text down another 50. So 30 plus 50 is 80. Alrighty, let's see what that looks like. Okay, looking pretty good, I would say. Let me click on this button to open up our register screen. And I think these are looking a whole lot nicer. You might want to move up your login form since it looks like it did get pushed down just a smidge. So on our form in the login view, we might want to say the offset in the Y direction is -50, so that gets moved up as well. So let's do that. Okay, cool. So this looks a whole lot better positioned, and this looks good as well. So that is all that we have got for lesson 3. Make sure you hit that like button before clicking away, and let me know what you think of this header. Did you use a different shape? Did you use a different rotation? I quite like it. I think it looks pretty nice, even though it's fairly simple, but just having a nice rotation effect on it does give it a sense of creativity, if I don't say so myself. So appreciate y'all watching. I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome to lesson 4 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. We're going to continue where we left off, abstracting the header view and working on the register view. Before digging in, destroy that like button down below for the YouTube algorithm, and let's get to it. So we learned that we can use injected properties, or rather configurable properties, on our header view. That way we don't need to copy and paste all the hard work that we did in our login view for this beautiful looking header. Now that we've got that set up, we can jump back to register and we can indeed create a form for our actual registration. So let's do that. So I'm going to create a form here, and inside of it, we are going to use a text field for the user's full name first and foremost. We're going to have a binding for it. So I'm going to say this is $name. We'll copy and paste this actually in just a moment. Let me say text field style. And what I'm going to use here is our default text field style. Now that we've got this, just copy and paste it a total of 3 times and change the last one to be a secure field, and just change all of the bindings and placeholders. So this one here will be email address, this one here will be password, and I actually never explained it or mentioned it, but a secure field basically just shows you asterisks when you type rather than the text itself. Now it's yelling at me because this binding does not exist, or this state. So we're going to change these and create these right up above, and we'll learn where we can abstract these to in a later video, perhaps this video. I haven't decided yet actually. So I'll make this one name, email, and password. And these are actually the data properties to which SwiftUI will write the value to as the user types. So once I enter in my name, it'll actually go to the name state property up above. So let's give this a build and let's do a Command-Shift-P just to refresh our preview on the right-hand side. We can actually also adjust this. I'm going to hit this little icon and say show me this in the dark mode color scheme. Alrighty, we're going to offset this form by y -50, similar to what we did in our login screen. And we also want a button here. Now, similar to what we did for our header view, it doesn't really make sense to start creating this button everywhere with the Z stack and this rounded rectangle, so on and so forth. So what we can actually do is create a custom button. And our custom button can actually go and do all this stuff for us such that we don't need to duplicate all the effort. So let me create a view to do exactly that. So let's hit Command N, and we're going to look for a SwiftUI view. And we're going to call this a TL button, TL for to-do list. It's a common naming convention where you prefix the name of your views with your app's abbreviated initials. So you can choose to call it whatever you'd like, but inside of here, I'm going to actually just paste in that button. Now, this view, similar to our header view, will take in a title and it'll take in a background color. So this title is what will show up on our button, and this background title, rather background color, will be what our rounded rectangle does indeed show. Similar to our header, we want to pass in some values for our dummy data for our preview down here. Maybe we'll say this button is pink. All right, hit Command-Shift-P. We should see our preview, hopefully, once Xcode decides to get its life together. Awesome, there it is. And now that we've got this here, we can actually start using it. But there is a problem. That problem is the fact that we need to be able to pass in via a closure what functionality should be called when this button is tapped, right? Like what action should occur. Let's change this to action here. The way we can do that is with a simple closure. So here I will say an action is a closure that takes no arguments, returning void. And inside of the button tab, we can say, hey, just call that action closure that we've got up above. Here it's yelling at me that we don't actually have an action. So we will fill that in, and just like so, we should be able to successfully build. Now let's jump back to our login view, and this is where we're gonna actually use that TL button. So let's do it. So let me make a TL button. All right, we're gonna create it with a title. We'll say the title is login. The color is going to be blue, and the action here will be attempt login. Now we could actually shorthand this and get rid of the word action, put the parenthesis there, and get rid of this extra parenthesis at the end. So there is our reusable button, and this is what we're going to actually be leveraging in our register view in literally 2 seconds. Alrighty, just line broke it a little bit to make it a little neater. Now let me copy this and let's jump into our register view. So at the bottom of this form, we want a button with a background of green is what I'm looking for, not register. And we want our title of our button to say create account. And here we're going to say attempt registration. Alrighty, so that looks pretty darn good. We want some padding on this button as well. Now, instead of sticking the padding in every single call site of this button, wouldn't it be great if our reusable component actually handled this for us? So we'll jump back to our TL button and add the padding on it itself, jumping back to registration, and hopefully we should have a smidge of padding on our register create account button, which it looks like we do. Let me just double check by adding a little bit of padding on this and see if that makes a difference. It actually doesn't look like it does. Okay, it looks like it did that time, but let me actually remove it here because something looks a little fishy. So let's actually get rid of the padding here, and let's see what that looks like back in our register. All right, I think that actually looks a little better. So instead of putting the padding on our TL button, let's just use it in the call site. So I take back the last minute of my rant. In some cases, abstraction is not good, and there was a live example of me taking back and walking back a pattern. So definitely these things are a little bespoke. So if you feel something looks better in one way over another, don't hesitate to change it. So cool, so we've got register looking pretty nifty. Let me give this a build and run in our simulator. Let's make sure that it does look nice. So I'm a new user around here, so I'll hit create account. I should be able to type in here, so I'll say, I am John Smith. My email is hello@iosacademy.io, and my password is password. So we can actually do a little bit of improvement on these fields. We probably don't want to capitalize the first letter of our email. So let's do all that. So for our fields, let's add a couple of modifiers. So we're going to say auto capitalization, and here we're going to say none. We are also going to say auto correction disabled, and let's do that for name as well. So we'll say auto correction disabled. And back in our login view, similar for our email fields here, we are indeed going to say auto capitalization will be none. And that should hopefully make the usability and functionality a little better so it's not randomly capitalizing stuff. So cool, that is the register and login. Now, I have mentioned over the past 2 or 3 videos that we are going to eventually abstract this stuff into ViewModels. And we have these ViewModel files here. So let's actually do a brief example of this since it's going to start to be used quite often in the upcoming videos. So a ViewModel essentially abstracts all of the business logic-y data stuff that a screen or a view needs to function. So on the login screen here, we've got our email and password. So instead of holding all the data in here, which you can imagine can grow exponentially, rather, what we'll do is we'll create an object that holds it for us. So let's jump into the login view model, and we're going to create a class in here with the same name as a file. So login view model. We'll say this is an observable object, something that we can observe. We'll add an init on here, and we're going to copy and paste those 2 states on here. And the difference is I'll change it to @published for both of them. Now, back inside our login view, we can delete these guys, and we can say we actually only hold on to a state object called ViewModel, and it's going to be an instance of our new class called login ViewModel. Now, you're going to get yelled at because this $email no longer exists here. Rather, what we want is $ViewModel. So we'll say $viewModel.email. Similarly here, we'll say $viewModel.password. More or less, we just moved this email and password into this single class, and this is where we're going to have functionality. For example, we'll create a function in here called login. Maybe we'll want a function in here to validate our actual email and password was indeed typed in and not just empty. Things of that nature, right? So instead of putting all of this kind of functionality, business logic, if you will, in the view, we're going to put it on the view model. So the last thing I'll mention is I do have a habit of using a lot of keyboard shortcuts. So if you ever see me closing this left panel, it's Command-0. And if you ever see me closing and opening the bottom console window, this thing down here where we have print statements, it's Command-Shift-Y. And Command-Shift-O for going to different files across your project. So I did want to call that out once more, since I do it a lot, and it can get annoying if you don't know how I'm jumping around so much. So that is all I've got for this lesson. We covered a whole lot of stuff. And I will see you guys in the next part. Welcome to the next lesson in the SwiftUI to-do list app. Props if you've made it this far. In this video, we're going to start working on validation for logging in, so making sure the user did indeed enter an email password, and then also writing the code to sign a user in once we start creating users. So before we get into things, drop a like down below and let's dig in. Okay, cool, good deal. So we created a register view. We also have this login view model, and we'll eventually want to create a register view model. But for now, in our login view model, we want to actually call this login function that does absolutely nothing yet when we tap on this gigantic login button. So let's actually do that. So let's go to our login view. And if you guys recall, we have this TL button. Now we do also hold our view model in this view. So what we can actually simply do is just say, view model, go ahead and log in, right? So how do we actually log a user in? Well, the first thing we'll want to do is make sure that, hey, has the user entered an email and password, or are they empty? Right? And if they're empty, we probably want to show like an error message or something instead of the app just sitting there looking like it's broken. So let's do that. So the first thing we're going to say here is guard that email isn't empty and that password isn't empty, otherwise return, meaning stop. Now, what happens if as a user I just hit the space button a few times? Well, that's no good. So let me say email trimming characters in white space isn't empty. So if I just hit a bunch of tabs and spaces, it's going to basically trim that out and make sure that it's not empty. And we'll do the exact same thing for our password. So let's say trimming characters in white space, and I'll actually bump this onto the next line to make it look a little bit nicer. So cool, we briefly mentioned this published thing in the last video. We had changed it from state, but I didn't quite explain what it does. So similar to state, when it changes, a view will recompute and basically render any changes as a result of state changes. And the published property wrapper is no exception. So we're gonna actually see it in action now. With error handling. So let me give this a run. And what I'm going to do is, if we do have valid email and passwords filled in, we'll say, we'll print out called. And a print will go into this bottom thing here, which is our console. So let's give this a build and run. And you'll see if I type in test, and I'll type in test into the password as well, we'll see called gets printed out at the way very bottom right there. Let me actually clear that out and hit it again. That way you guys can see it. Cool, so called is there. Now what happens if I delete even one of these and I hit this login a few times? Well, nothing happens. But as a user, by looking at it, shouldn't I get yelled at for some reason, basically some error message telling me, hey, what is going on? Why isn't it working? And the answer is yes, it should definitely notify you in some way, shape, or form that, hey, you need to fill in both email and password. So what we'll do here is we're going to introduce a published property that is going to be error message. It's going to be equal to an empty string by default. And back in our login view, what we will do is write in our form, or you can do it above the form as well. It's a little up to you. It's subjective. We're going to say if let message is our ViewModel.error message. We want to show the error message, which is our message. We're going to say it's going to have a foreground color of red. So we're basically going to show a red colored text label. And that way we should be able to show the error. So what it's actually yelling at me about here is that we're actually trying to unwrap this, and that's actually not correct. What we want to verify is that instead of it being non-nil, we want to make sure it's not empty. And if it's not empty, we should show our ViewModel.error message. And if you make that adjustment, you'll see the error go away and your project should be building. So now in our login function, before we return, we can actually say error message is please fill in all fields. Okay, give it a build and run. And let's start by just hitting login. And just like that, we did see something popped up. We actually can't see it quite yet because it's either underneath our login form or the color is not correct. So let's see what's going on. So I believe it's underneath the login form. So what I'll actually do is I will wrap it inside of our form. The reason it's underneath is because we're doing offset 50. So we're moving it up But let me hit this, and just like that, you'll see please fill in all fields does indeed show up. So cool, so now that that is showing up, let's write out the rest of our function here. We are also going to do some very basic validation on the email address. There are more quote unquote correct ways to do this validation, but we'll keep it simple. We know that a email should have both a @ and a dot in it. So email@foo.com has both of those. So we're going to guard that the email does contain a @ and email does contain a period. Otherwise, we're going to return and we're going to say error message equals please enter valid email. And let's make sure we spell everything correctly and add nice periods at the end. And whenever actually we tap that login button, we want to reset the error message. We don't want it to show up. So we'll also just say when this function first gets called, make it an empty string. That way the error message will go away. So once we have a valid email and we know we have got a password, what we can do is we can actually start leveraging Firebase to log in. So what I want you to do is import Firebase auth. And Firebase auth will essentially give you functionality to try to log a user in with the provided email address and password. The other thing that I will draw your attention to is we created this validate function. I'm gonna actually make it private and we're gonna move all of this jazz into the validate function. And we're gonna have this function return either true or false if we're able to validate all of the user's inputs and continue. So if we don't have a valid email or password, we'll return false. Same for email. Otherwise, we'll return true. Now up here, I can simply say validate. And if we're not able to validate, we're just gonna stop. Now, once we have validated, we're gonna say try to log the user in by doing the following. So we're gonna say auth.auth, which gives us a reference to Firebase Authentication. And we're gonna say try to sign in with an email and a password. So it's this variance down here. Email is email, password is password. And that's actually literally all you need to do to sign in. So if you hit Command B to build, you'll see that your code is compiling and you should be able to run. Now, of course, you won't actually be able to sign in quite yet because we have not created any users. And that's actually what we're gonna work on in the next few videos. But this is indeed all you need to do to sign in a user. You might be wondering, well, how do I get rid of this login screen? We probably don't want to show this. And we're going to do that in a better way versus just, manually dismissing this and showing something else. So that is all I've got for this lesson. Kudos to you if you've made it this far. We've actually done a lot more than what our app, shows. Even though it's only 2 screens, we've got a whole bunch of stuff set up and we're in really good shape. So appreciate you watching. Drop a like before clicking on to the next lesson and I will see you there. What is going on, guys? Welcome to the next lesson in the SwiftUI to-do list app. In the last part, we wrote the login functionality, and in this lesson, we're going to finally start creating users, registering them, and actually logging into our app once those new accounts are created. So drop a like down below, and let's continue onward. So we did talk about in our login view model how we can log a user in, sign them in. Now, we obviously can't do that yet because we don't even have a user. So what we'll want to do is work on a register flow. Now, we do have a register view where we can input all this information, but we don't have a register view model yet. So let's actually go and create one. So let me just make sure I'm in the proper file. I indeed am. So we are going to want a register view model that is an observable object. Now, if I jump to our register view, you might recall we have 3 state properties on here for the name, email, and password. We're going to take all of these guys and we will toss them. Let's see if I can find that view model again into the register view model, and we will change them all to be published. And that's a fancy little trick you saw me do there. If you hold Option, you can actually get multiple cursors by just clicking and dragging. And it's a good way to save a bunch of time when you're writing code. So cool, so now that we have got this, we want to do two things when the user hits the register button. We want to validate, similar to what we did in login, that the input is all valid. And we also want to then create their account. Now, creating their account also entails creating a new record in Firebase, which I believe I have open here, for that user. So we want to create their account in Authentication, and then we also want to insert the information about a user, right? So their name, their email, their ID, right? Maybe not their password, that's not very secure, but certainly some information about them. So let's do it. So first we're gonna say guard. We want to validate, so let's say validate here, else we will return. Validate is going to return a bool similar to what login did. And we'll want to do three things, or two things. Make sure the name, email, and password are not empty, and make sure email looks good. So let's do that. So we're going to say guard that name trimming characters in white space character set is not empty. And let me just copy and paste this a total of 3 times and just adjust it here. Otherwise, we will go and return. I do realize we don't have an error message here, but we will just gloss over that and get this working first and foremost. We are also going to guard that the email does contain a @ and that the email does contain a period. Otherwise, we'll return false. And maybe one other thing that I want to enforce is that the length of a password is greater than or equal to 6, right? Privacy is important, security is important, so let's at least require our users to enter in something that is longer than 6 characters. So password does indeed qualify, which is what we're going to be using, but a 2-letter password is probably not secure. So once we have, validated the user's inputs here, we want to create a user. So let's do that. So we can do auth. Let's do that one more time after importing Firebase auth, which I forgot to do. So let's import Firebase auth up here, and we're going to say auth.auth, and we want to create a user with an email and a password. Email is email. Password is password, and we should also get a completion block from this, which will give us our newly created user, our newly created user results, and an error. What I'm going to do after that is I want to make sure that we have a new user. So we can say our user is our results.user, and this user does have something called a UID off of it, which is the newly created user's unique identifier. So let me actually call this user ID. Now, once the user ID is received from this new user creation, we want to actually create our own model for a user, basically a data object that represents a user, and insert it into the database. So let's say private func insert user record. Now this function is going to take in a user ID, and we are only going to, in this function, call that function. So we'll say insert user ID, user ID. We do want to say self optional with that question mark and stick a weak self up here since we don't want to cause a memory leak. If you're not familiar with that, I've got a dedicated video on it. It's a detail that is important, but I'm going to gloss over at this time just to make our app work before getting into the nitty gritty. So inserting a user record in the database is actually quite easy. Now, we first need to create an object that represents a user. So let's jump into our models folder, and we have a user file in here, and let's create a user struct. This struct is going to be codable, and we'll discuss momentarily why we need this and what it's going to be used for. So our user is going to have a ID, which is going to be of type string. They're going to have a name. They'll have an email address, And maybe they'll also have a joined, which will be a time interval representing when they did in fact join our app. When did they sign up? So this is what a user is going to look like. So let's jump back to our register view model and say new user is going to be a user. And we are going to create it with the ID, name is name, email is email, and joined is going to be the current date, and we're going to say time interval since 1970. And now you might be wondering, what on earth is this? The short and sweet of it is we're not able to save a date object directly into Firebase, into a database. So there are a variety of ways you can do this. You can save a string, you can save the number of seconds from the date since 1970. We're going to go with that latter approach of doing this. So now that we've created this new user object, we need to insert it into our database. So let's do that. So we're going to say our database is firestore.firestore, and to access Firestore, which is our database, we do need to import Firestore up here. And now we can say firestore.firestore. Now the way that this database works is that records are stored in collections and documents. So we're going to have a collection for users where all of our inserted records go. So we'll say our collection of users. We're going to want to have a document with the ID for our user ID, which is being passed in right here. And we're going to say set some data for this. Now, if you look at set data, it actually takes a dictionary in. So what you could do, and you could be tempted to do this, is say, hey, well, name is name, and we can read all of this information off of this model up here. But not only is that a little verbose, but it's a little error prone as well. What happens if you make a typo? Then suddenly you have a typo that doesn't match your model. And it gets a little annoying, to be frank. So the reason we actually made this user object codable is we're going to employ a handy little trick via an extension to be able to convert anything that's codable into a nice dictionary for us with strings and values that we can put into the database. So to do that, we're going to open up this other folder and we'll create a Swift file called extensions. And what I'll extend here is I'm going to write an extension onto encodable, which is the part of the codable protocol that is responsible for encoding it to data. And what I'll do is I will write a function called as dictionary that will return to us a dictionary of string and any. And inside of here, we'll do the following. We first are going to say, give me data from the current thing that is codable. So we'll say data equals JSON encoder, and I want to encode self. And the reason that we have this as a guard here is that we're going to say try optional, and if we fail, we're simply going to return an empty dictionary. Now, once we have actually got data, what we'll say is convert this to JSON, aka a dictionary, by saying JSON serialization. Give me a JSON object with this data, and we're going to put a try, which is why we're inside of a do catch here. If we catch an error, or if we throw an error that we catch, we'll return an empty dictionary. Otherwise, we're going to cast this to string any, and finally, we can return JSON, otherwise an empty dictionary. So if this is a little confusing, not to worry, this is kind of a bit of a workaround instead of doing things manually, but it is something that will come in super handy. If you're not super familiar with Codable and Encodable, I encourage you to read up on it. It's not that difficult, it's not as scary as it sounds, but it will do wonders for you. So let's jump back to our register view model, if I'm not mistaken, where we were before. Let me see where it went. There it is. And what we'll do here is we're going to say save or set data new user as dictionary. This is what we expect to put into our database. Let's do a command B to build, and let's see if we have any errors. So it looks like it can't find $name, email, or password in our register view anymore, which makes sense because we moved them to the view model. So let's stick a state object in here. And we're going to say the view model for this view is going to be a register view model. You can create it just like that. And this is going to now be $viewModel.name, $viewModel.email, and $viewModel, say it with me, .password. Go ahead and hit Command B to build, and everything should be compiling. And in fact, we should now be able to create a user. All right, so let's give it a shot. And now before we do so, one thing that I do want to point out is in our main view for our app that it opens up to, we're showing this login view directly, right? What we probably want to do is check if the user is signed in, and based on that, we want to actually show something else. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we're going to have a state object in here, and the reason I'm doing this before we attempt to create a user is so we can actually see the app signing in kind of real time. So we're going to create a main view model like so. Whoops, let's try that one more time. Main view model. Now we have a file with this name with, I believe, nothing in it. So let's create a view model for this observable object. And we're going to have two things inside of here. The first one is going to be published. We're going to say current user ID. And we are also going to have an initializer that basically takes nothing. And we will also have a public var saying is signed in. And the signed in is going to return the current user not being nil. So bear with me, we're almost done, I promise. We're going to import Firebase auth. And if we have a user, that means we are signed in, right? So we're going to say auth.current user. If this doesn't equal nil, meaning there's a value for the current user, that means we're signed in. If it does equal nil, that means we're not signed in. And you might be wondering, well, why do we have this current user ID thing here and it's being defaulted to an empty string? The reason is because we want to actually observe from Firebase when the current user changes. And we can do that via the following. We're going to say auth.auth, and we want to add a did change listener, so state change listener. And what we actually get in this is auth, which we can, I guess, ignore, and a user. And the user is an important piece here because we are going to say self.current user ID will be, whoops, let's try that again, will be user.uid, their unique ID, otherwise an empty string. In other words, whenever the user signs in or signs out, this published will be triggered, right? And that will hereby update our view. Now we also are going to hang on to this handler. So the type of this handler, I don't actually recall, but let's see what we can remember. I believe it is a auth state change handle, listener handle. So here we can say self.handler. And we also want this to be self-optional to not cause a memory leak. So here we will say weak self. Alrighty, let's see what the issue is that it's yelling at me here about, and then we can continue. And we'll actually want to make this handler a private variable, so something that's mutable, and by default it'll be nil, so we're gonna make it optional as well, and I think that's actually why it's yelling at me here, and that error indeed should go away. We also stuck the weak self here to not, once again, cause a retain cycle leaking memory. The last thing I'll do inside of here is say dispatch queue.main.async. Because assigning to this published property updates the view, we do want to do it on the main thread, i.e. the main queue. So now that we've got this view model here, we can actually use it in our main view, SwiftUI view. So we already had created this here. Let's make sure this is indeed created. All right, hit Command B, everything should hopefully be building. And instead of just showing the login view every single time, we can now use our newly created published property. So we can say, first and foremost, if ViewModel is signed in, and our view model, the current user property is not empty, meaning it must be assigned to something, then we want to show the signed in state. So signed in. Otherwise, we're going to show the login view. So the signed in state is actually going to be a tab view, but just for now, let's show the to-do list view just like that. And in this to-do list view, I'm simply going to stick in a label that says, welcome to your account with an exclamation mark, because we're super excited about it. So I believe that is everything that we need to do. Let's create an account and let's see if this works. If we have any issues, we will debug them together. So we're going to go to create a new account, and I'm going to try to create a new account here. So we're going to try to create an account. So I'll type in my name. We're going to type in hello@iosacademy.io, and our super secret password is going to be password. And let me make sure I spelled that correct so we don't get locked out of our own account. Let me just expand the console here as well and clear it, and we'll hit this create account button and make sure something does indeed happen. So I clicked it, and nothing is happening, and I bet I know why, because we never hooked up this register button tap to actually call ViewModel.register. So make sure you don't forget to do that. Back in your register view, you want to actually hook up the action for your TL button. So let's try that for the second time, and let's see if we missed anything else. So type in my name, I will type in an email, and I will also type in a password and hit create account. And boom, just like that, we are in our account. And the coolest thing about this is because Firebase can persist account state, aka auth, if I rerun the app, we should actually go directly to our account. And that's because in our main view, we're saying, hey, if we are signed in from our view model and we have a user ID, go and show the to-do list view. The last thing I'll do is validate that we did indeed create database records and a new user. So in authentication, we do have this new user. It actually even gives you the date when the last sign-in occurred. And in our database, let's make sure we've got users, there's our unique ID, and boom, there's all of our information. So we've got my name, we've got our joined time interval here, which should just be a long number. We've got our user ID, and we've got our email. So congrats, we're finally signing people up. We have an authentication system that works. Obviously, no way to sign out quite yet. We're going to work on that, but kudos to you if you made it this far. Destroy that like button before clicking away. Let me know in the comments if you have any issues, if you have any suggestions, any problems you face. I'm going to do my best to help y'all out. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next part. Welcome to lesson 7 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. We're going to pick up where we left off. Before we get into things, destroy that like button down below for the algorithm. Hit subscribe if you're still not subscribed and into iOS and watching along. Let's continue. So in this part, we're going to actually build out this kind of account UI. So we got a user created, we are signed in, but whenever we open the app, we actually get just this like random screen where we just have a label. What we actually want to see is a tab bar at the bottom and a nice profile title for the profile tab and to-do list title for the other tab, as well as a plus button at the top where we're eventually going to show a new screen to add new to-do list items. So let's get to it. So in our main view, we currently are just showing this to-do list view. And instead of showing this, what I actually would want to show is a tab view. Let me just lowercase that I. And a tab view allows, as the name kind of implies, to show a tab bar for each of the views inside of it. So here we're going to have a to-do list view, and it's going to have a modifier called a tab item. And the tab item is simply going to have two things inside of it. It's going to have both a label and a icon. So let me create this label here. And what I'm looking for is this one. So the first one will be home. And the system image that we're going to use is house. Now, SF symbols is Apple's image icon library, so we're going to use those. You can, of course, use your own image as well, but we're going to use the ones provided by Apple since they are sufficient for our use case. Now, the other tab is going to be for our profile view, with the title being profile and the image being person.circle. Alrighty, so hit Command B. And on the right-hand side, we actually see a preview for the login screen, which is not ideal, but we'll just build and run this into a simulator. And we should hopefully start to see a tab bar at the bottom. If we don't see it for whatever reason, we probably screwed something up, but we actually do see it. So I see home here and profile. And actually, looks like the profile view that we created, the template gave us this hello world, so it is indeed changing. So cool, good deal. Let's jump into our to-do list view and let's start putting some stuff in here. So we want to have a navigation view in here so we can actually start to see a title. So we'll throw a VStack. And we want to see a title at the top left here that says to-do list or some title more or less. And the way we get that to show up is by adding a navigation title modifier. You just got to spell it correctly, unlike me, to this VStack in here. So I'm going to do to-do list in my case. And actually, we'll copy this exact same thing into the profile view. Everything in here right now is just a template. And the difference is we'll just change the title that we see here to profile. So give that a build and run, and you should see a nice title at the top for to-do list, and we should see the same thing when we switch to the profile tab. And I'm just changing the light mode and dark mode here so y'all can see what the two variants look like. So the next thing that we want to do for our to-do list view here, that particular tab, is show a plus button at the top right. And essentially, once the user clicks on that plus button, we want to show another screen. And that other screen is going to be where the user can enter a title and select the due date for a new to-do list item. Now, to do that actual, everything I described, basically show the button at the top right, we're going to use something called a toolbar. And a toolbar, let's see if I can find it, this one here, we want to just create a button inside of this. Now the button is going to take a action and label. So the action, don't worry about this quite yet, but for the label, we'll use an image with a system name, and this is going to be, I believe, plus is the icon I am going for, which will show a little plus icon at the top right that actually did indeed just show up there. So we're in pretty good shape. This is kind of the template for our logged in state. Before we wrap up this video, I will do two important things. The first one is we have a file for to-do list view and ViewModel, and we don't have anything in here. So I will at least stub this out so we have something to work with. So it's an observable object. We'll put an initializer on here. And let's actually just copy this and let's create one for profile as well. So let's see here, we have profile. I will toss this in here. It is going to be our profile view model. And while we're doing this, we might as well see any other files that are empty and take care of those. So here we have our new item view model. So let's just add this in here as well. So new item view model. And I believe this is the last one actually here. This one is to-do list item view model. It actually looks like we have a duplicate here. Let's see what the difference is. So this one is to-do list item view, and this is a to-do list view item view model. So let's just add a comment since they're named so similarly so we don't screw them up. So this is going to be view model for list of items view. We'll say primary tab, and let me copy this into this guy here, and let's just make sure we change the name here. So this file is called to-do list item view. So we're going to call this to-do list item view model, and this is view model for a single to-do list item view, each row in items list. So I'm just adding comments here for myself, and mainly because they're named so similarly that we don't want to screw them up. Now that we've got this created here, let's just hang on to them on our actual SwiftUI views, since we are going to use them, and then we can wrap up this video. So for our to-do list view, we can simply create here a state object, and this state object will be of type our to-do list view model, which we basically just went and created. So we should have that here, and we're also going to want to pass something into this to-do list view, but let's sidebar that for a quick moment. And let's also jump to our profile view. Let's see if I can find it. And in our profile view, we will also create the associated view model. Pretty simple, profile view model. Make sure you hit Command B, make sure everything is still building. Hopefully no problems. We didn't do anything too crazy. And yeah, let's do one last thing, and then I promise we'll wrap up in this video. And that last thing that we're gonna do is, I mentioned we wanna pass something into this to-do list view. If you recall, the to-do list view is what we use for our primary tab in our main view when we are in the signed in state. What we actually want to pass into this view is the user ID. And the reason we're going to want to do this is because the user ID is what we will use to listen in real time for to-do list items for a particular user. So we can basically just pass in ViewModel.currentUserID. The reason it's yelling at me is because in here we do need to just make sure we appropriately hang on to this. So here we will say self.userid is user ID, and up here I will just create private let user ID of type string. All right, so we're in pretty good shape. We want to also pass in a user ID here for our preview content, and let's see if there's anything else we can clean up. We can abstract this tab view if we want. We can create a function down here. We can annotate it at view builder and say this is account view, and our account view here is basically going to return some view, and we can, instead of making it a function, make it a computed property, just toss that in here, and here we can say show the account view, just like that. If you build, everything should be working perfectly fine. This just abstracts basically what we had in the body here to its own computed property. We did mark it as a view builder as well, which allows us to basically do this. Let's give this a build and run, make sure everything is still a-okay, and then we will wrap this video up and continue in lesson 8. All right, so we're looking pretty darn nifty. Everything is good. Plus button not working just quite yet, but we do have 2 tabs where we have some real estate on our screen now to build. I will see you in the next lesson where we'll continue building this. Hit that like button before clicking on over to the next part, and I'll catch you guys there. All right, fine people of YouTube, welcome to lesson 8 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. In the last part, we started setting up our basic account UI with these nice tabs and bars at the top, the plus button here as well. In this video, we'll continue particularly working on presenting something when we tap on this plus button to create a new to-do list item. So but without further ado, destroy that like button down below and let's continue building. So what do we have here? Well, we have our plus button in place, and that resides in our to-do list view, particularly this button that we added to the toolbar. And when we tap on it, we want something to happen. And that begs the question, well, what do we want it to do when we tap on it? Well, similar to what we have done in other cases, we're going to basically assign a binding that is going to inform our view that, hey, we want to show another view. Now, the other view we want to show is our new item view. So let's see if we have that here. We do indeed have it here. And inside of here, what I will do is I'm going to start by tossing in a VStack. Let's hit Command-Shift-P so we can actually see this thing on the right-hand side. That's how we build this stuff, by actually seeing it. And let's start by creating a label here, and we're going to say new item. We're going to make this bold, and perhaps we're going to bump up its font size as well. I'm going to say this is a font size of size maybe like 32. Once we've added that there, the next thing we're going to want in here is a form. And if you just think about the basic semantics of adding a new element to a to-do list app, we want to have a title or a name, call it what you will. We are going to want to have a way to select a due date and then basically a button. So let's create all of these. We'll have a text field is what I'm looking for here. So we're going to say this is going to be either name or title, call it what you will. We're going to want a binding, and like we've done in all of our other forms, we're going to have a published property in our view model. I will call it title. So let's actually stick that view model on here, which we have not done yet. So let's say StateObject var view model is going to be basically the associated view model that we have named super conveniently like so. Similar to other view models, let's jump into here and actually start sticking on some published properties. So I'm going to say published var title will be an empty string. We also in this case want a due date, and a due date by default will be a instance of a date, and whenever you create a date, it gets initialized as the current date and time. Kind of important, and we'll see in a moment why that is, but let's actually create this. We also want a date picker, and with our date picker, what we want to do is have a title key here for due date. Our selection is going to be viewModel.dueDate. Let's hit Command-Shift-P. Let's see what that's looking like. All right, so we've got our due date here. We also got a field at the top. And we do want to have a date picker style. And if you just type in date picker style, you'll see that there's a wheel, there's a default, compact. I'm going to change this to be, let's try graphical. I actually don't recall what that looks like, but we'll change it and hope it's the correct one. It is indeed the correct one. It's the one where you can see the entirety of the date as well as the time at the bottom, which is what I'm looking for. Let's also go and add a text field style here, and what we want is a default text field style. So this is looking pretty darn good already. And lastly, we want a TL button. Remember that button that we had created to be reusable. So we will have a title here of save, and maybe we will use pink as the button, and then we'll have an action in here. And this action will probably trigger something on our view model, something along the lines of, let's do viewModel.save. We'll want to create that function there since it doesn't exist yet, even though we will be implementing it much later on. All right, so let's do Command B, make sure that we are able to build. So we have this pretty nifty looking view here as soon as it loads, but we don't really have a way to present this yet. Let me also stick a padding off this, make our button a little more breathable in terms of spacing there. So let's jump back into our simulator. When we tap on the plus button up here, we want to basically show this view via a sheet, right? We want it to be modally presented, in other words. To do that, luckily, SwiftUI has a modifier that is super creatively called, you guessed it, sheet. So a sheet can take in a binding for if it's presented or not, and then content as well. So for our binding here, we are going to say ViewModel, and we are going to say showing new item view, just like that. And essentially, this is going to be a published property off of the view model that we've got here. So we'll say at published var showing this, and by default it's false, right? Because when our app first launches and gets to this screen, we don't want this to be shown right away. And the content that is going to be shown is our new item view. So go ahead and hit Command B to just compile, make sure everything is working. Let's give our preview a run, and let's give this a run in our simulator and tap on this plus button. All right, so something weird is going on. We're not actually showing it. And I see what I forgot to do. When we tap on the button, we actually want to set this to be true. So here we will say view model showing. We're gonna set this to true. All right, let's give it a shot for the second time. Hopefully when we tap this now, we should see that other screen. Beautiful, we do indeed see it. So our new item label at the top is a slightly bit ugly because it's so flush to the top of the screen. So let me jump into that view and let's take care of that. So we'll jump into here, and on this, perhaps we can add a little bit of padding. And if that's not sufficient, we can always adjust the top padding in particular. But I think what we'll want to do is just change the top. So I'll change top and maybe make it 100, which will push it down from the top 100 points. Okay, cool. Looking a little better in light mode. In dark mode, it looks pretty nice. We can type in a title here. So maybe we need to get some milk, and I can select one of these dates, as well as I have a nice time picker for hour, minute, as well as AM and PM. Okay, so we're not going to actually work on saving this quite yet. We do want a way to dismiss that screen. So you just saw there, I can actually swipe it down, but it would also be great if I can get it to go away once we hit this save button. Presumably we'll want to do that once the user has actually hit save and we have actually gone ahead and saved that result into the database. So what I'll create here is a binding that we need to pass in, and this is going to be a new item presented, and we're not going to actually have a default value for this. It will be of type bool, but rather what we'll do is wherever we're creating this view, you'll see, and this is our to-do list view, that it actually asks us, go ahead and pass in your new item presented binding. And what we can do here is simply pass in ViewModel.showing new item view. Let me just hit Command B and make sure you prefix this with a $, otherwise it'll yell at you like it just did for me. And let's see why this is yelling now. It is actually yelling at me now because we need to do the same thing for our preview here. So in our preview, I'll go ahead and say binding. With a wrapped value. So let's see, getter and setter. I guess we can do it this way. We'll make this simple. So in this case, we will return true. And for the setter, we'll just do nothing. And that should be sufficient. Let's see if our preview still works. Sometimes if you don't set up your SwiftUI previews appropriately, they don't decide to load. But in our case, they do. So cool, so we have this button here in our new item view, and whenever we try to go and save a new element, assuming it did save correctly, we can also now say, because we have this binding in here, we can say new item presented, and we can set this guy to false, which should trigger our view to go away. So let's give this a shot in our simulator. I'll get this presented, I'll hit save, and boom, it disappears beautifully, just like that. The last thing that I want to address in this video is some basic validation of inputting stuff on the screen, and more importantly, handling that validation and if something goes wrong, right? So showing an alert to the user if they're trying to save without a title, or if they're trying to select a due date that's older than today, so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do here is inside of the save functionality, rather the view model, what I'll do here is I'll say var can save, and we're basically creating a computed property here in which we're going to check a few things. We are going to first say guard that the title isn't empty, else we'll say, hey, return false. We'll also make sure that we're going to guard title that is trimming in the white space character set. That way we don't want to go ahead and actually allow the user to save just a bunch of spaces and tabs. The next thing that we are going to do in here is we're going to say, make sure that the due date is greater than or equal to today minus 86,400 seconds. And I'm going to explain that in 2 seconds. Alrighty, we're going to return false otherwise. So by saying due date is greater than today, which is just date, that makes sense, right? Make sure it's greater than or equal to today. The problem becomes that this date is initialized to the current date, like the actual calendar date. In my case, it's April 30th, but also the hour and second. And we get into some time zone complexity. So what we actually do is we're subtracting 86,400 seconds, and you might be wondering what on earth is this number? This is how many seconds exist in the day. So we're taking the current date and just subtracting 24 hours. And we're saying make sure the due date is greater than or equal to yesterday. So in some cases, you will be able to pick yesterday, but this will allow you to pick today and not run into any weird issues. It's a pretty nifty little edge case, but I'm just going to do it this way for the sake of simplicity. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that there, before we try to save a new element right away, what I'll do is I'll say if ViewModel can save, do that. Otherwise, we want to show some sort of alert. And the way we'll do that is by saying ViewModel dot show alert will be true. And I realize that show alert does not exist yet, so not to worry. So let's jump into our ViewModel here, and like we did for so many other published properties, let's create a new one. This is going to be called show alert, and by default, it will be false. Now back inside our view, we're gonna use a very conveniently named modifier, and you guessed it, it's literally called alert. And alert, we're gonna use a variant that has a is presented and a content, so the first one actually. And this will be ViewModel.showAlert. And in the content, we're basically gonna show the user a alert with a title and a message. So let's do title is going to be error, and message is going to be please fill in all fields and select due date newer than today or newer, I guess. So let's reword this. So select the due date that is today or newer. So let's give this a build-in run and let's see if we have any issues. It looks like we already have an issue, and that issue is that our message here should probably be a text if I was to be a guessing man. So let's change these to text, aka labels. I'm also going to line break this so we can actually read it a little better. And let's give this a build-in run. Let's try to save a new element without filling anything in here. So I'm going to hit save, and I should get yelled at, and it should not dismiss, which indeed we do. Now let me type in an element. Let's say we need to buy some milk. Let's buy some eggs instead. Eggs are expensive these days. Everyone needs eggs. So let's buy some eggs. Let's say we got to do this tomorrow, May 1st. And maybe I'm a crazy person and I'm going to do this at 5:45 a.m. when no stores are open. So let's do that. We expect to see this view dismissed because all the fields are valid. So if I hit save, it does indeed dismiss. So that is all we've got in this video. Let's do a quick recap because we actually did a lot. We created the UI for this new item view. And the way we did that is by creating a form that we've got right here. We also have this text at the top inside. All of this is inside of a VStack, so it's vertically oriented and nicely nested. We also created a view model with some basic logic functionality to verify that we can indeed save the data and can save. In the view model here is checking that we have a title set that's not empty and that our due date is in appropriate range of today or after. And then save isn't doing anything yet. We also, back in our view for the to-do list view, we leveraged the sheet modifier and we created this is presented via a binding, and we present this new item view. So that's how we're going to get this to show up and get it functioning. In the next video, we're going to start working on actually saving and creating these to-do list items, getting them to show up here, so on and so forth. So hit that like button before clicking away if you've made it this far. Kudos to you for keeping up and staying the course with this series. Appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next part. Welcome back to the next lesson in the SwiftUI to-do list app. We're going to continue where we left off. Basically, in this video, we're going to start to save new to-do list items to our database. We're going to talk about the model, etc., etc. Before we dig in, destroy that like button down below as per usual, and let's continue. So we set up our new item view for creating a new to-do list item with a due date as well as a title, I should say. So due date and a title. Let's jump into that view. It is our new item view. And we also set up a view model with a save button, basically a save button, as well as a save function that is tied to it. And this is in our new item view model. So what we're going to want to do in here is import both Firebase auth as well as import Firebase Firestore, aka our database. Now, once we hit save, we're going to do two things. We are going to say guard can save. Now, this is something that we should have already checked for in our views logic, but we'll just stick it here as another, sanity check. And what we want to do is create a new instance of a to-do list item model from the supply data we have, our title and our due date. Once we create the model, and let's actually stick in comments while I blabber on. So we're going to create a model. Once we create a model, we want to save the model to the database. And the way we're going to save it is basically as a sub-collection of the current user. So we'll also want to get the current user ID here, right? Because if you recall, in our database, the way this works is we have a collection called users, we have a user ID, and then sub of that, we would have a collection called maybe like to-dos or items, whatever you want to call it, and that's where this new element would go into. So we also are going to put a comment here of get current user ID. So let's do all this one by one. So getting the current user ID is actually pretty simple. We can actually say guard let UID is going to be auth from Firebase auth.auth current user.uid, else we are going to return. So we know that the user is signed in, which is how they've even gotten this far. So we should absolutely always have a user ID. We're just going to read it off of the Firebase auth context. So now that we have that, we want to create a model, but we haven't defined this yet. So let's skip that for a hot second. Now, in this case, we want to, or the last case I should say, is get an instance of our database and say database with a collection of users. Now this should have a document of our user ID, another collection off of that called maybe to-dos, another document off of that, and this should be whatever our new model ID is. Let's call it 1, 2, 3 for now. And then we want to set data for this, and this is going to be a dictionary. And that's basically how we're going to save a new to-do list item. Now, obviously, we glossed over the most important piece here, and that's creating our new item model. We have an empty Swift file called to-do list item under models. Let's open it up and declare a to-do list item model in here. So alrighty, so I'm going to create a struct and call it to-do list item. It is going to be codable, and it is also going to be identifiable. And we're going to start sticking some stuff in here. So we're going to have a string type for ID. We're going to have a title, basically what the user types in for the item. We'll have a due date of type time interval. We'll have a created date of type time interval as well. This is basically when the user has actually created the element, not when it's due per se. And we're going to have a variable that is going to be isDone of type bool. And the reason this is a var is so we can actually mutate this. Now, this object is also going to have a mutating function on it called toggle done, maybe is what we'll call it. Or maybe what we can do is say set done. And we can call this state bool. And essentially inside of here, we'll say isDone is state. And the reason that we need this here is once we bring in the functionality to check or uncheck if a item is done, we are going to want to modify the model to reflect this before we save it or update it in our database. The reason this is mutating here is because this is a struct. Structs are value types, and if you're not familiar, I've got dedicated videos on this as well. So hit Command B, make sure things are still building, and let's come back to our view model where we're going to instantiate this new item. So we'll say new item is a to-do list item, and it gives us all this nice jazz here. So let me just line break it to make it look a little nicer and more readable, and we'll start filling all of this out. Okay, cool. So we're going to create a new ID up above. It's going to be a UUID, and we'll get the UUID string from it. This is just basically a unique new identifier. That is what we will use for our ID. Title is title. Due date is going to be due date, and we're going to get the, once again, time interval since 1970. Created date will be now, and we're also going to get time interval since 1970. And by default, every item is not done, so we can just hard code false into is done. Now that we've done that, here we're going to use our new ID in the database, and the data we're going to set on this as new item. And remember that handy function we wrote called as dictionary? Well, boom, we're going to use it again here to convert this model to a dictionary that we can write into the database. Hit Command B, everything should be building. Let's go to our browser here. We'll just refresh it real quick before we try to insert an element. And let's hit Command R to build and run this in our simulator. And let's give this a shot. So we're logged in here. We'll hit this little plus. We're going to say, let's call this buy some more eggs with an exclamation mark because supposedly that's exciting. We'll say May 1st. And I'll hit save here. So it looks like it did dismiss. We don't see obviously anything here because we haven't done much in this view. But if I come back to our database, under this user, we should have a new collection called to-dos, which in fact we do. It should have a new single element with some random ID with all the data that we have indeed saved. So we've got that is done is false, buy some more eggs with an exclamation mark. We've got the ID and the due date and created date respectively as time intervals. So awesome, we're finally saving to-do list items and the flow of creation is basically done. What's left to do is actually fetch these out of the database, be able to mark them as done or not done, delete them, and then of course this profile tab over here where we'll also be able to sign out. So that is all I've got in this video. As a quick recap, we basically implemented this save functionality here. We get the user ID off of the Firebase auth object. We created a model here, which is representing a single to-do list item entry, and we basically inserted into the database. Just to take a quick peek, a revisit of our to-do list item, we have some constant properties on here. We have a variable for is done, which is mutable, aka we can flip the value of this true or false. And we have a mutating function to actually assign is done, which will make a copy of this model. That's how value types work, and return that copy to us with the new value. So that is all I've got in this video. Appreciate y'all watching. Destroy that like button before clicking on to the next lesson, and I will see you guys there. Welcome to lesson 10 of the SwiftUI to-do list app series. In the last part, we were successfully saving new entries, new items to our database. And in this part, we're gonna finally fetch them and query them out in a real-time way such that when we make new entries, we also see them. So hit that like button before we dive in and let's do it. Let's dig right in. So what we wanna work on in this particular video is our to-do list view. And we wanna actually get our elements, our to-do list items to start showing up, kind of important. So I want to call your attention to our initializer here. We're passing in the user ID. And I briefly mentioned that we're going to need this, but I didn't quite clarify why we need it. Well, the reason we need it is because Firestore, our database, has a handy property wrapper, some functionality where we can actually say, hey, observe all the entries in the database at a particular path. And when I say path here, what I mean is our data that we care about lives at users, the user ID, to-dos, and then basically all of our entries, right? So n number of to-do list items. Well, this user ID actually fits in right here, right? It's the user ID specific for whom we want to get items. This is why we actually need this here. So what we'll do up here is we actually first want to import Firestore, Firebase Firestore Swift. And we're going to create something up here called a Firestore query. We'll say this is var items, and it's going to be a list of to-do list item. And this is the model that we basically used to create a new item before we converted it to a dictionary and stuck it in our database. So we're essentially saying that we're going to have a query that'll continuously listen for items. Now this is now yelling at me with an error because it's saying, well, hey, you have not assigned items yet. We can't actually assign it up here with a hard-coded value because this is going to differ based on whatever user is signed in. And this is where this user ID comes into play. So what we can do here is say self._items. The reason we're using underscore is this is a convention for property wrappers, and this at thing is a property wrapper up here. And we can actually say that this equals a Firestore query, and we care to create a query with a collection path, and it's going to be this collection path right above that I've commented out. So it's going to be users, then we're going to stick in the user ID / to-dos. And we can actually get rid of this user ID here, like so. So this is our items. If you hit Command B, it should hopefully be building. The other thing that I will do is down in our preview content, we stuck in just an empty string, which is not good, no bueno, because it's not going to actually render anything because that ID isn't real. So what I will do is from our actual database, I'm going to copy our unique user ID that we actually have created and inserted into the database. That way, when I do Command-Shift-P, we should hopefully get a preview rendering here. So now that we've got this items presumably working, we should be able to loop over these items and show a element for each entry. So let's create a list over items, and we're going to have item in. And let's just start by doing a text, and we'll say item.title. I will also say list style will be a plain list style. And just like that, it's actually quite fast. You already see, we see buy some more eggs get populated. So that's pretty darn cool already. Now, we're going to want this row to look a little bit nicer. We're going to want maybe the due date below it. We want maybe a little check mark on the right of it. And this is why we actually already created another view, which is a to-do list item view. This represents a single item, and this is where we will encapsulate all that logic. Now this gets created with a to-do list item, just like that. And we will probably want a respective view model for this as well momentarily, but let's just handle setting this up. So we're gonna have a horizontal stack inside of here, and we wanna make sure we spell that right. And we're gonna then have a vertical stack. Now our vertical stack will have two text labels, the first one showing the item's title, the next one showing the item's due date. But rather than showing the due date directly, what I want to do is create a date element, time interval since 1970. And once we have created this here, we want to actually also format this. So I will say dot formatted, and we want to format this with a appropriate date and time. So the date here, perhaps we will format this with abbreviated, and for the time, we will make this shortened. So this will actually take your date object and make it look a whole lot nicer. Let's see what else we want to do. We'll want to have a spacer. And let's just hit Command-Shift-P to see this in action, just so we have something here. It wants a dummy item, so let me create one here just to work with. We'll say ID is 123, title is get milk. Maybe we'll have due date is the current date, time interval since 1970, and created will basically be the same thing, and is done will be perhaps false. So let's hit Command-P to see our preview here one more time. And let's see why this is yelling at me. We need to have some parentheses for our spacer, and let's preview what this is looking like. So cool, we've got this vertical stack here. It looks like it is centering both of these text labels. So I am going to say alignment here is leading. and hopefully that looks a little better. Okay, looking a little better. We probably also want our font size to be a little bigger for the actual item. I'll also bold the actual item. And for this one here, I will say the font here will be a footnote. And in this case, the font here will be, let's try title and see how obnoxiously large that is and if it works. All right, it's not actually too bad. We probably also want this to have a foreground color that's a little lighter, so maybe like a gray color is sufficient, but let's see if that looks too dull. It's slightly dull, so what I'll actually go with here is we can use a UI color, and what I'm gonna look for is a secondary label. This is basically like a lighter label color, and we can actually probably get rid of the bold color here. All right, cool. So the reason we put this inside of a horizontal stack is on the right-hand side of this is we want a button, and this button should basically be tappable to mark this element as done or not done. In the label, the actual case of what we're going to show here, it's going to be a image with a system name, and the system name is going to essentially be if the item is done, we are going to show a filled in circle. Otherwise, we are just going to show a normal circle. So here we're going to have a circle dot, I believe it's checkmark dot fill. Let's see if I remembered that correctly. All right, we'll do Command Shift P, and let's set our is done in our preview to be true and make sure something shows up. It looks like nothing does, so it might have been checkmark .circle.fill. Okay, it looks like that's correct. And just as a reference, you don't need to be guessing these. If you hit this little plus at the top right of Xcode, and then you actually hit this little icon, you can actually search for all of Apple's iconography in here. There's also a dedicated SF Symbols app to search for various icons, but I just happen to remember, hence why I'm guessing. So awesome. So we've got that check mark there. The view is kind of smushed to the edge of the screen. I don't think that's a problem though, because when we end up using it in our list that we'll actually, I guess, just do now, it should look better. So let's create this with an item, which is an item. And because we're in a list, things are looking better. Now our font looks really wonky. So let me get rid of this and let me actually make it, maybe we'll make it like body, and see if that looks a little better, because that title was a little large. Otherwise, perhaps we'll specify our own titles here. So I should be able to click on this button here and something should happen. Right now, nothing is happening, but at least this view shows up. I should be able to also swipe on these rows. So to do that, we're gonna add a swipe action modifier. And swipe action will basically just have a button in here, and the button will be delete. And let's see if we can actually swipe on this. I believe that's how we can get this to work. Yep. We probably want it to be red since it would look a tad bit nicer. So let's actually use a different permutation of this button. We want the one with an action, which will be to delete. And the label here, we will go with delete with a foreground color of red, so it looks a little more panicky. Since you are deleting something, we want to make sure that's your intention. Alrighty, hit Command B, make sure everything's looking good. Alrighty, let's try that one more time. It looks like it's still not red. Let's run it in a simulator. Let me see what it looks like over here. Alright, so it's definitely not red. Let's see why that's happening. Let's try background color here. Perhaps that's what I'm looking for. And it's still not red. Okay, let's see what's going on. So we're gonna debug this together. So let's actually change this back to what I had here as a standard button, and let's make this color.red. And I could have swore this should turn red that way, but perhaps not. So we might have to come back to this and indeed debug it. But I could have swore this is how I've gotten this to be red before. But anyways, we've got our to-do list items rendering here. When I click on them, nothing happens. When I hit delete, nothing happens. We eventually, well, I guess we can stick it in right now. we're going to want to implement this function, which is delete an item. So we're going to say func delete item, and this should be to-do list item, just like that. Or maybe we'll just pass in the to-do list item ID. And whenever this button is tapped, we can say ViewModel delete item.id, like that. And similarly, we've got that button with the check mark here as well. So what we'll want to actually do is whenever we tap on this check mark button, we'll want to say ViewModel dot update check, or set or toggle check mark, something along the lines, right? So basically flip the check mark. If it's checked, uncheck it. If it's unchecked, check it. So we'll say toggle is done is, I guess, a better function name here. I don't believe we have a view model for this yet. Let me see if we do. I think actually we do. I remember creating it and having different names for it. So we do have this guy here. Let's stick this function on here. And let's go back to our view here. So this is in our single item. So we want to-do list item view, and we want to create an instance of this state object, or of this view model, I should say, as a state object. So now that we've got an instance here of our view model, we should be able to say toggle is done, item is item. We'll want to pass this in. I don't want to implement this in this video, but I at least want to stub out these functions. That way we have a nice jumping off point as we continue. So this is where we will mark this. And if this item changes, of course, we should indeed see our UI update as well. So I guess that's a good stopping point for this video. We now actually have our elements showing up in this to-do list, and the gut check to make sure it works properly is let's add a new item. So we're gonna say finish up video. We're gonna stick with today since that's probably what we're doing today, and I'll hit done, and boom, we see finish up video did indeed get created for April 30th at 6:34 p.m., which is indeed my local time here on the East Coast of the US. So awesome, kudos to you if you've gotten this far. The app is more or less functional now. Hope to see you in the next lessons. Hit that like button before jumping on over there. I will see you guys there. Welcome to lesson 11 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. We're gonna continue working on this app. We finally got our items showing up in the last lesson. In this lesson, we're gonna focus on deleting items. Before jumping in, hit that like button and let's continue. So in the last video, I couldn't get the delete button when we swipe on over on an item to be read, and I realized 1 second after ending the recording of that video what mistake I was making there. So let's actually go and amend that. So we don't want to actually change the background of this button. What we want to change is the tint of the button. So if we change it and we make it red and you refresh your preview with the Command Option P and you drag on over, you'll see that we now have delete here. So beautiful. Let's actually get this deletion working. So we already created a function called delete on our view model where we're passing in the item. So we should be able to simply make this database deletion call. So let's import Firebase Firestore, and let's actually get a reference to our database by saying Firestore.firestore. And then we'll say database.collection in our users. In our document, we want to put the user ID here, which we'll do in a second. We'll talk about that. In our collection of to-dos, we should have a document with a document ID that we're passing in. And we're going to simply say, hey, go ahead and delete that. We don't need any callback because our Firestore query in our view is listening for live updates in our actual collection path. Everything should just seamlessly update and be magical. All right, so before we can actually give this a run, we need to put in a user ID here. Well, there's two options we have. We can pass this into our delete function, but that doesn't really make sense because then we have to hang on to user ID on the view. Well, but we're already passing user ID via our constructor into this Firestore query. So how do we actually get it into our view model? We can, of course, get it from the Firebase auth like we did elsewhere, but that's kind of redundant. So let's think of a better way to do this. So instead of creating this state object like this, what I can actually do is I can define it here and we can actually assign it similar to how we're assigning items here. We can specify that our constructor here is going to take in a user ID. I will say self.userID is user ID for our view model. And we're essentially going to instantiate this view model for the state object in the constructor. So we'll say self underscore, once again, that property wrapper semantic is going to be a state object with the wrapped value. And the wrapped value here will be our view model concrete class. The user ID is user ID. So let's see if I can get this cleaned up a little bit in terms of line breaking because it's a little wonky right now. All right, so that's basically what we want to do. So what we're essentially doing is instead of creating the view model as a stored member on this view, we're going to create it by creating a state object like so and passing in that view model with the associated user ID that we're getting through this view's initializer. Hopefully that's not too confusing. The syntax might be a little confusing, but more or less we're putting the user ID into this view model. Awesome. So now that we've got the user ID in here, we can actually use it in our deletion call. So yeah, that's basically all there is to it. Good practice. We're going to hit Command Option / to get this autocomplete for documentation. And we're just going to add some docs, some comments here. And this is going to say delete to-do list item. Let's make sure we spell that right. And this is going to be item ID to delete, just like that. And let's see if we can get this working. All right, let's build and run to a simulator. Let me add in a couple elements here. So maybe we'll say go running. We'll save this guy. We should see it pop up. Maybe we'll also come in here and say buy a jacket because it is indeed raining out. And I could do it with a new jacket. Also going on vacation soon. So maybe we can say plan vacation fun things. All right, let me save that. All right, so we're good to go. So let's try deleting some stuff. So I'm gonna say, let's say we already bought some eggs. So we don't need this anymore. So I'm gonna drag this over and hit delete and boom, it's gone. So let's try to close and reopen this app and that should not come back. All right, so definitely does not come back. Let's delete the rest of these. Alrighty, let's delete all of these. Apparently I'm done with everything that I needed to do because there's nothing left here. Let's close the app and reopen it. Whoops, that's the other version of the app. Let's open this one here that we're building. And nothing indeed comes back. So we've successfully set up deletion of to-do list items. Just to recap, we pass in our user ID into our view model for the to-do list view at this point. We've implemented the delete function to more or less just delete the record at the path of users, user ID, to-dos, and then the ID of the to-do list item that we would like to delete. Back in our to-do list view, we now assign the view model rather than having it already created up here. It is a state object where the wrapped value is our view model type, passing in the user ID. We amended our button in the swipe action to use a tint rather than a background. That's how we actually get it to show up as red. And we finally got deletion working. So that is all I've got in this video. We are going to work on hitting that done button, the little check mark on the right of an item in the next part. So let's actually end this video with a new element here. So we want to get groceries, not grocers. So let's create that. We'll make this little circle over here interactive in the next part. So I'll catch you all there. Welcome to the next lesson in the SwiftUI To-Do app series. And in this video, what we're going to focus on is basically getting this check mark working on the right-hand side here. So basically marking things as done or not done. So let's continue. Before we get into things, smash that like button down below and let's continue. So we already got swipe to delete working here. So if I swipe this and hit delete, boom, it's gone. Let's create a couple items. So I am going to say get milk here, and maybe we'll create just 2 to get started with, and then we'll focus on that little check mark. So let's say go running, because eating healthy and running is supposedly good for you. So I will add it there. So awesome. So we've got this like circle thing here, and essentially that is a part of our item view for a single to-do list item. And what we are showing is a image, and if the is done property on an item is true, we show the check mark with the filled in circle. Otherwise, we show just the circle. Now, we want to do 2 things here. The first thing is we want something to happen when we tap on this particular button. So right now, we actually already have it hooked up to be toggle. The other thing we want to do is we want to validate that the UI updates properly once we update our database record. So let's do this first. So we say toggle is done. And if you recall, the to-do list item, if we click into here, does have a function that says set done, and we can pass in a new state. So what I'll do here is here I'll say new item is going to be our item. So we're going to basically create a copy of it. And we're going to say item set done. And this is going to be item dot is done. Whoops, is done. We're going to set the inverse of this. So in other words, if is done originally is true, it'll be false. If it's false, it becomes true. The reason we used new item here is because if we try to do this on item, you'll see that it will yell at you because item is a constant. It's immutable. It's passed in as a value type. So we need to create a copy of it, which is why we just call this new item. Maybe it's actually more suitable to call it item copy, not to confuse it. So now that we have actually gone ahead and created this copy and changed its is done property, we need to update in our database the record for this to-do list item. And to do so, it's particularly easy. So we need to import 2 things here. So we're going to say import Firebase auth, and we're also going to say import Firebase Firestore, that one right there. We are going to want to get the user ID like we have previously gotten. So I'll say UID is going to be auth.auth.current-user.uid, else we can go and hit return and we'll just stop. Next up, we can say the database is firestore.firestore, and I can now say database.collections. The collection we want to update is users, and users should have a document, which is the user ID, which will then have a collection for to-dos, which should have a to-do item, which is going to be our item copy.id. Once again, we're not making a new item, we're just updating the data for an existing item. I will say set data, and this will be item copy.as dictionary. So that should be good enough actually to get our checkmark working. So let's give this a build and run in our simulator, and let's see what happens when we hit that check. All right, so I'm gonna hit this and boom, it's checked. And boom, it's unchecked. Now, what's actually happening here is SwiftUI is updating our view in real time as a result of the model changing. And the model that we are changing in the database, once it changes in our to-do list view, it's actually being read in our Firestore query, and we're getting the new version of the item. So if I actually close this here and I reopen the app, you'll see that when it opens as being checked, because we're basically saving in the database that, hey, this element should be checked. It is indeed done, right? So we have some persistence going on there, which is obviously useful for a to-do list app. You don't want it to be reset every time you open it and lose, all the information about what's done and not done. The other thing that I want to quickly tweak on here before wrapping up this video is I want to change the color of that check mark. So our checkmark view, what I will go and change here is the foreground color on our image. You can make it whatever you'd like. I feel like blue is a nice color for check marks, so I'm going to make mine blue. So we'll go and give this a build and run in our simulator, make sure our check marks are showing up as blue. Beautiful, they are. You can use obviously any color. I really like the way this looks. And yeah, that's basically the meat and potatoes of a to-do list app. We can create elements, we can delete them, we can mark them as done or not done. You can also add some padding for each of these elements if you'd like, just to space things out a little bit. I recognize that it is a little congested, but to each their own of preference of how it should look. But that is all I've got in this part. Drop a like down below before clicking on to the next lesson. Let me know in the comments if you found this particularly nice, that SwiftUI takes care of a bunch of this heavy lifting for you. Appreciate you watching. Say hello in the comments as well. Connect on the socials. Always love hearing from you guys, and I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome to lesson 13 of the SwiftUI to-do list app. In this lesson, we're going to work on the profile tab here since we've got nothing going on here. Before we dive in, destroy that like button down below and let's start building. So we've got our actual to-do list working in this primary home tab, but we want to show something in this profile tab as well, particularly some information about the user as well as a way to sign the user out. So we have a profile view here. Let's open it up and let's get to it. Now, what do we actually want to show in here? It would be nice to show an avatar image, even though we don't allow the user to, upload images, and maybe a person circle image. And then we want to show some info about the user. So things like their name, maybe their email, maybe member since, and then we'll also want to show a sign out button. So let's start adding all of these. So we're going to start with the image. It's going to be a system name image, or we're going to work with person.circle. We're going to say it's going to be resizable. We'll set an aspect ratio of fit, so it always stays in the proper ratio, doesn't get distorted or anything. We'll set a nice foreground color of blue, and then we'll also set a frame with a width of 125 as well as a height of 125. So it's a nice square aspect ratio. Next up, inside of here, what I will do is create a VStack where we have the alignment as leading. Let's get rid of this extra content thing there. And we will create some horizontal stacks. Now, let's just get one to show up here so we know what this looks like. But we're going to say the first text here will be name, like so, and then we'll have another label right next to it, which hopefully will load in user data and be able to show the name. So let me just copy and paste this a few times. So we'll have name, email, member since. We'll want to obviously change the value on the right of it. And then finally at the bottom here, we will have a label, and let's actually use a TL button, which is our custom button that we've created. Our title will be sign out. Let's actually use the wording logout since we've used login elsewhere. And our action here will probably want to say ViewModel dot logout, which we don't actually have a function for this, so we've got some work for us to do in this video. So let me jump into this particular view model, and something is wonky here. We're using the profile view model here, and we have toggle is done inside of this. Oh no, what did we do? I think I screwed up something here. So our profile view is actually being used, or our profile view model, it looks like, is being used rather than our today item view model. So let's see what is going on. Something is totally screwed up here, but we're going to fix it. So here we have a today list to do item. Okay, so we accidentally put the code for a single to-do list item inside of here, which is not a problem, not to worry. We're going to take the implementation of this toggle function. We're going to cut it with a command X and let me paste it into this guy. Now, before I continue on the profile journey, let's take the name of that view model. Let's come back to our single to-do list item here, and let's make sure we use the proper view model there. And before we try to build to make sure nothing is screwed up, don't forget we need to add a logout function inside of here in the profile view model. So it looks like we built and we do have some problems here. Let's see what's going on. Yep, we do need to import in here Firebase auth, which is what we had imported in the other view model where I accidentally put the code. That's okay. We're going to import Firestore as well, and everything should be building. Okay, so now that we fixed that, let's go back to profile and just give this preview a refresh, command option P, and we should hopefully see something here. Looks like we're not actually seeing it, so let's see what gives. Let's give this a build and run. Let's see if everything is looking good. Let's go to our preview. Okay, so in our preview, we see our button here, we see our information, and we see our avatar image at the top. But this button is just obnoxiously big. So let's see how we can go about adjusting this. Let me put a spacer below this, and let's see if this looks any better. Otherwise, we might fall back to the normal button. Okay, so that button is still absolutely obnoxious. So I'm gonna create a standard button. We're gonna say this is Logout, and this button will have a tint color of red. So let's see what that looks like. All right, okay, so I think this looks a little better. Everything is a little smushed together, so we probably want a little bit of spacing. So let's actually do that. We'll add a padding on here. I'll also add a padding on here. And even for the image up here, perhaps we'll add a smidge of padding. So let's give that a run again and check it out. All right, we're looking a whole lot better. Maybe we want the labels here, the left label in each H stack to be bold. So I'm gonna stick a bold on each of these. And perhaps on each of these, we also want a little bit of padding. So I'm gonna stick a padding on each of these as well and see if that looks a little nicer. Something about a good amount of margin and padding just makes everything so much nicer. So, okay, so we wanna get this logout functionality working, but the first thing that we wanna do, and more importantly, is get the user's profile to load and show here. So we actually would need to fetch this from Firestore, and we don't actually have it at the moment. So what I will do is I am going to open up this view model for our profile, and we're gonna say we have an @published var user of type user, and by default, it's going to equal basically nil. We don't have a user, we're gonna want to fetch that user. So let's create a function called fetch, and what we'll do inside of here is pretty simple. We're going to say guard let user ID is going to be auth.auth.currentUser.uid, similar to what we have done elsewhere. Now that we have this from the database, Firestore.firestore, we can say, hey, in the collections of users, get the document with this user ID. That's what I'm looking for. And we're gonna basically say, hey, get this document. Now, when we say fetch a document, we actually get a snapshot back and the error. Once we have that, we're gonna say guard let the data that we are going to read off of this query is snapshot.data, like so. And we'll just verify that the error indeed is nil. Once we have this data, we can actually create a user object and assign it to this. So we are going to capture weak self so we don't cause a memory leak. Like I mentioned, I'm going to gloss over this just to not go down a rabbit hole. And we do want to do the following on the main queue, since assigning a user will indeed trigger a view refresh. So let's create a user. So we're going to say self.current user, which I just called user in this case, is an instance of a user. And let's start filling all of this stuff in. So ID, name, email, and joined. So we are going to say that this comes from data. This will be ID, and you just want to cast it to the appropriate type. So it's string, string, string. Just make sure you update these and you don't have any typos. And this one here is going to be joined as a time interval. Otherwise, here we'll just stick a 0. And this should be sufficient to fetch the current user. Now, once we have the current user, we can use it to fill out all the user profile information. So by default, we don't actually have this user. So what we'll be able to do is the following. I'm gonna say, let's take all of this jazz, and I can say if let user is ViewModel.user, we can continue. Otherwise, we want to say, show a label that says loading profile with a ... Now, once we have a user, instead of hard coding my name everywhere, we can say user.name, user.email, and then this one here is going to be a date, time interval since 1970, and this is going to be user dot, what I'm looking for is joined, and we do want to format this with a date, which will be abbreviated, and a time, which will be shortened. Alrighty, we did a lot of coding there, so let's give this a build and run, and let's see it in action. We expect to see this say loading, and we expect it to load the profile, but it turns out we never actually called that fetch function that we implemented inside of our view model. So where we're going to actually implement that is in a handler, in a modifier on appeared. So once our navigation view appears here, we're going to say viewModel.fetch user. Alrighty, so let's give this a build and run, and as soon as this appears, we should hopefully fetch our user, and we are good to go. So there we see our name, our email address, as well as when we joined this awesome to-do list app. So that's our basic profile. We still need to hook up Logout, but one thing that I do want to do is I do want to at least abstract out this monstrosity of this view stuff that we've got going on here. So let me take all the stuff inside of this if statement, and what I will do is I will say this is profile, user is user, and I'm going to create a view builder annotated function here called profile that takes in a user of type user, returns some view, and I'm just going to stick all of that implementation in there, which is going to just reduce how our body looks, which makes it look a lot cleaner, easier to work with. This error is just transient. It should go away once Xcode gets its life together. There it goes. So a little bit of cleanup. So we do still have that logout button here, and when we tap it, we're calling viewModel.logout. Luckily, this is really easy to implement. All we want to do in a do catch block, in the catch, I am going to print out the error. That should never ever happen, but we will say try auth.auth, and we're going to sign out. You might be wondering, well, hey, how are we going to actually show the login screen again? Well, it's pretty simple actually, because we already handled it. If you remember, in our main view model, we've got this handy dandy listener here, this handler for our auth state did change event, and that should update our main view to show the login screen. So let's try to log out, and we'll see if this whole shebang actually works. So fingers crossed, everybody hold your breath. All right, boom. So we are now logged out of the app. Let me give it a run, make sure we are still logged out, doesn't accidentally log us back in. And moment of truth, let's try to log back in to our account. Our super secret password is password, and boom, we are signed in. It loads in our results. We can update them. We can add more results. We'll say verify app. Let's pick a time in the future. All right, there's a new date. We'll change the time here. Maybe we'll go to an earlier time, and I will save this, and there is our results. And that's basically the majority, if not all, functionality for our SwiftUI to-do list app. Now, while it's super exciting, we're not quite done yet. We don't actually have an app icon yet. If we look at this app on the home screen, kind of ugly. We also want like a nice loading image when we launch the app, also known as a launch screen. So one more video to go in terms of building this out. Appreciate you watching. Drop a like before clicking on to the next lesson, and I will see you guys there. Welcome to the next and last lesson, where we're actually going to be fussing around in our Xcode project, particularly focusing on setting up a app icon as well as a launch screen. Before we jump into things, hit that like button down below, throw a fire and a rocket emoji in the comments if you've made it this far. Kudos to you, and let's get on with it. So I've actually got this app icon that I created already. I use Canva to create this for free. They've got a bunch of awesome resources there. It's really easy to use. They should totally sponsor me. I'm not sponsored by them, but check out Canva. I've got this dinky app icon, but we're going to use this for our icon as well as set up a launch screen. So let's get to it. So the first thing we want to do is in Xcode, I'm going to remove this from full screen. Let me also collapse some of these folders since we're just about done. We'll open up assets here, this assets catalog, and you should have an app icon asset in here, which tells you that it takes a single 1024 by 1024 image, and we can drag this in. This image is indeed 1024 by 1024. Now that we have done that, we can just give this a stop and run again in our simulator, and we should see our app icon appear. Now, one common issue that people see with Xcode and the simulator is, you actually saw it right there, it was very fast, but the icon shows up and just randomly disappears. So if you actually delete the app from your simulator and just run it again to do it, to install it fresh and go back to your home screen, you should see the icon persist. So that's basically setting up an app icon, super duper simple. Just make sure you create an image that's 1024 by 1024. Again, Canva is free to do so. The next thing we want to do is set up a launch screen. So this is a screen that you see while your app is in the process of launching. Now, obviously this app is quite fast, but sometimes based on the device and how old it is and battery and a whole host of things, you're going to see an intermediate screen. We actually saw it right there for a smidge second, and that's known as your launch screen. Now, the SwiftUI template doesn't actually give this to you out of the box. What we're going to do is create a new file that we're going to set as our launch screen. So hit Command N for new file and search for a launch screen in here. Leave the name as default. And this will essentially give you a template, which is a storyboard that looks like this. You can actually use a drag and drop interface to adjust this as you'd like. And back in our project navigator, if we scroll down here, there is a section where we have app icons and launch screen. And what we will do is hit this little drop down for launch screen, and you should see that newly created launch screen, that storyboard file in here. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time designing this. What I will do is change the title to be to-do list, and we will change the background color by opening up the attribute inspector here, this right panel. We'll pick a fun color, maybe we'll go with system purple, and I'll also change the text color here. We will go with white, and I will also adjust the font to be, let's see, bold is perfectly cool with me. I'll just bump it up to maybe like 44, and we're looking pretty good. So let's give it a build and run. And when our app is launching, we should see that purple screen for a smidge. We actually saw it right there. And that actually concludes building a to-do list app entirely in SwiftUI from scratch with Firebase. So fairly straightforward. If you think about it, what did we do? We did a lot of repetition in terms of the basic constructs. We have a view with an associated view model with logic and whatnot in there to handle interaction of buttons and whether or not one view should be shown instead of another. We also have models that represent the data types in our app. In our case, it's only a user and to-do list item. And in other, what we actually only adjusted was we added a single function, which is the extension on encodable protocol. This allows us to convert it to a dictionary. And in our to-do list app, we initialized Firebase here, Firebase app.configure, after we brought in our Google Services info plist file, which has all the information for our Firebase project. So if you made it this far, huge congrats, give yourself a round of applause. Let me know if you would like to see anything in this project change down in the comments. Source code will be made available for this project. I appreciate you all watching and sticking around. Hope to see you in other lessons, series, and videos across the channel while we continue building and polishing iOS, iPad, Mac, and watchOS apps. Thanks again for watching. I will see you in another video.